THENIGHTSHIFT. My co-worker walked out the back door at 2 a.m. 20 minutes later, I watched him standing motionless in the rain on camera 7 while someone wearing his face walked in through the front lobby. I want to start with Arthur because Arthur is the part of this that still hurts the most, and because understanding who he was makes what happened to him land the way it deserves to land rather than just being set dressing for the strange thing that replaced him. Arthur was 58 years old, a retired mechanic who took the night audit job because his wife had insomnia and the house felt small at 2 a.m. and he needed somewhere to be that wasn't his own living room. He was a creature of absolute routine, the most reliably predictable person I have ever worked beside. Every night at exactly 2:15 he would pat his chest pocket for his cigarettes, pick up his dented silver thermos of decaf, give me a single wordless nod, and go out the side exit by the loading dock to smoke 2 cigarettes while listening to a pocket transistor radio. 15 minutes, never more. He always came back in through the same door he went out. 6 months of working together, and that routine had never varied by more than a minute in either direction. I had stopped thinking of it as something that could vary. It was as fixed as the shift itself, 11 to 7. Rain or shine, Arthur at 2:15, home by 7:30. That predictability was the thing I trusted most about the job. It was also, I understand now, the thing that something else had studied and decided to use. The hotel was a brutalist concrete block from the late 70s, just off the interstate at a state line. The kind of place that existed to be functional and nothing more. 64 rooms, a lobby that smelled permanently of industrial carpet cleaner and old rain, fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency you eventually stopped registering as sound. I was the night auditor, which meant I ran the financial close on the antiquated property management system, while the building settled around me and the vending machines down the hall cycled through their compressor hum. On the night in question, the hotel was completely sold out due to a convention nearby, which meant no walk-ins to expect and nothing to break the routine. Rain had been coming down since dusk, the hard lateral kind that finds the gaps in window frames and makes the parking lot look like a surface of moving black glass. Arthur left at 2:15. I watched his reflection cross the lobby windows toward the back hallway, heard the fire door close with its usual resonant thud, and turned back to the cash drawer discrepancy I had been working through. An hour passed without me noticing, which is the kind of thing that happens when you're absorbed in reconciling numbers that won't cooperate. When I looked up at the clock and saw 3:20, I understood immediately that something was wrong, because Arthur's 15 minutes had become 65, and there was no version of Arthur that produced that number. I picked up the radio and called his name and got empty static in return. I told myself the reasonable things. His radio battery had died, he'd gone to the break room, he'd fallen asleep in his car. I told myself these things and I almost believed them, and then I looked at the security monitor array on the desk, and I looked at camera 7, which the manager had always dismissed as broken, always static after midnight, not worth monitoring. The manager had been specific and consistent about this. Don't bother with camera 7, and I had never questioned it, because there was no reason to question it, because broken cameras are a mundane institutional reality and I had no context for why it might matter. Camera 7 was not showing static. It was showing a sharp, clean black and white feed of the loading dock in the rain, and standing in the center of the frame with his back to the camera facing the dark Trillin beyond the dock was Arthur. He was not smoking. He was not moving. His arms were hanging at his sides in the particular way that arms hang when the person they belong to is not thinking about them at all, not performing stillness, but simply absent from their own body. He was standing in a freezing down, without a hood up, without any of the small physical adjustments person makes against cold and rain, and he had been out there for over an hour. I reached for the radio to tell him to come inside. The automatic lobby doors hissed open. I turned around. Arthur was walking through the front entrance, shaking an umbrella I had never seen him carry, moving with the ease of someone arriving rather than returning. He walked behind the front desk and dropped into his chair with a heavy sigh and set his thermos on the counter and said it was nasty out there in the same raspy voice I had been hearing every night for 6 months. I looked at camera 7. The figure was still on the dock, still facing the trees, still not moving. I looked at the man next to me. He was looking at the computer screen and his expression was Arthur's expression, the particular slight frown Arthur made when he was reading something on the screen that required attention. I asked him how he had come in through the front doors and he said he always came in through the front because the side door sticks in the rain, which was wrong factually, specifically, verifiably wrong, and he said it without any hesitation in the voice of someone stating an obvious truth. I looked at his boots. The floor around his chair was dry. Not slightly damp, not drying dry, as though he had walked across the lobby from a car that was parked directly at the entrance, and not from the rain-soaked parking lot that any entrance to this building required crossing. His jacket was immaculate. His thermos was not the dented silver one I had watched him carry out the side door. It was unmarked pristine, catching the fluorescent light cleanly in a way that the original thermos with its accumulated dents and scratches never could have. I put my hands under the desk so he would not see them shaking, and I said I was just tired, and I turned my face toward my computer screen, and I began thinking very carefully about the geometry of the lobby, and where the exits were and what was between me and each of them. Over the next 2 hours, I watched him with the peripheral attention of someone who cannot afford to be caught watching. His typing was the detail that clarified everything. His fingers moved above the keyboard in a rapid, convincing blur that never actually made contact with the keys. The screen in front of him stayed blank. He was performing the motor memory of a task without executing it the way a person might move their hands through familiar motions in a dream. Every 15 minutes, with a precision that I eventually started timing against the clock, because I needed to confirm what I was observing, he turned his head toward me at the same angle, produced the same close-mouthed smile, and said the same sentence in the same cadence, with the same slight rasp on the same words. Not similar each time. Identical. The way a recording is identical to itself every time you play it. I nodded each time and said something minimal and turned back to my screen, and the interval would reset and begin again. At 5 a.m. he stood up and said he needed to check the boiler and walked toward the back hallway without waiting for a response. The fire door closed behind him. I gave it 30 seconds, and then I moved not toward the front X. It's something in me understood without being able to fully articulate why that leaving the building was not the right move, that whatever had learned to wear Arthur's face and replicate his voice and time, his speech to the quarter minute had been watching this building and this shift long enough to anticipate a run for the parking lot but toward the employee break room, because I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I decided anything else. The break room was down a short corridor near the basement stairs. I pushed the door open and turned on the light. Arthur's dented silver thermos was on the table. His car keys were next to it, and his wallet. On the floor, arranged with a neatness that was worse somehow than any disorder would have been, were his uniform jacket, his shirt, his pants and his boots laid out in the shape of a person who had simply ceased to occupy them, every item soaked through and smelling of rain and cold mud. I stood in the doorway looking at this for long enough that the master keyring I was holding slipped out of my hand and hit the linoleum with a crash that rang out through the whole corridor and down the basement stairs into the dark below. The footsteps started immediately. Not boots on concrete, the wet, bare slapping sound of skin on the basement steps. Moving up fast, and from somewhere in that darkness, the voice came up ahead of whatever was making the footsteps. Arthur's voice, processed through something that was not quite managing it correctly any more the way a recording degrades when it's been compressed too many times, asking me if it was a quiet night. I was through the fire doors and across the lobby and out the front entrance before I had consciously decided to run. I got to my car, I drove, and I kept driving until the sky went from black to grey to the pale flat light of early morning, and I did not check the rearview mirror because I had made a decision about what I was, and was not willing to see back there. The police found the brick room exactly as I left it. The clothes, the thermos, the keys, the wallet, all there. They did not find Arthur Nat that morning and Nat in the weeks of searching that followed. The manager told the responding officers that I had likely experienced a stress-related episode, and that I had a history of working long hours, and that the night audit shift was isolating, and these things sometimes produced perceptual disturbance, is in otherwise reliable employees. I understand why he said that. It is the explanation that does not require anyone to account for what was on camera 7 for over an hour, or for the clothes on the brick room floor, or for the fact that whatever walked through the front lobby that night had studied Arthur's habits and his voice and his timing with a thoroughness that implied observation over a significant period of time, not a one-night event but a project methodical and patient, executed by something that understood that the easiest person to replace is the one everyone around them has stopped paying close attention to, because they are so completely, reliably, unchangingly themselves. I think about what it needed specifically to do, what it did. It needed to know that Arthur left at 2:15 every night. It needed to know which door he used and how long he was gone and what he carried and what he said when he came back. It needed to know his voice well enough to reproduce it, his cadence well enough to time it, his physical habits well enough to perform them for 2 hours under fluorescent light at close range. That kind of knowledge requires time and proximity, and a very particular kind of patience. I don't know how long it had been watching before that November night. I don't know what it wanted or what it was working toward or what it would have done when the shift ended and we were supposed to go to our separate cars and drive to our separate homes. I don't know if the thing standing on the loading dock looking at the trees was Arthur by that point or something that had already finished with him. Some questions I have stopped trying to answer because the answer doesn't change anything, and the process of pursuing it does something to the way I move through the world that I am not willing to accept as permanent. What I know is this: the camera that the manager told me was broken was not broken. The rule about not checking it after midnight was not about the camera's functionality. It was about not knowing what was on the other side of that information, because once you know, you cannot continue the shift as though you don't, and continuing the shift as though you don't is, I suspect, the only thing that had been keeping certain people safe. The rule existed to protect the people who followed it from exactly what happened to me when I broke it. I understand that now. I understood it, in fact, the moment I looked at camera 7 and looked at the lobby and understood what the discrepancy between those two images meant. Some things once seen cannot be made unseen, and the people who wrote that rule into the manager's handbook knew that too, and they had decided that not seeing was the better option. They were probably right. I just didn't know that yet because no one had told me what the rule was actually for, and by the time I found out it was already 3:20 in the morning, and Arthur had been standing in the rain for over an hour, and whatever had learned to wear his face was about to walk through the front doors. THEARCHIVALCLERK. The cubicle next to mine had been empty for 6 months. At 2 a.m. on a Thursday, someone was sitting in it, typing without stopping, without pausing, without ever once shifting in their chair. I took the graveyard shift at the insurance firm because it paid a 15% differential, and because the work itself, entry batch art, shivving, uploading completed files to the server, was the kind of task that requires enough attention to keep you functional but not enough to be genuinely draining, which meant I could do it at 2 a.m. in a sub-basement without it costing me anything I couldn't recover from. I had been doing it for 6 months. I knew the floor the way you know any space you spend 40 hours a week inside the specific hum of the server racks, the way the fluorescent lights in the far corner buzzed at a slightly higher pitch than the rest, the smell of ozone and floor wax that the ventilation system never quite cleared. There were 4 of us on the night team, and we had spread out across the floor naturally, each claiming a separate corner for the particular privacy of people who prefer to work without the awareness of other humans near by. The cubicle next to mine had been empty since my first day. The chair had been removed, the computer tower was gone, and the desk had accumulated a thin, even layer of dust that I had never seen disturbed. On a Thursday in February, I came in at midnight, swiped through the security turnstile, rode the elevator down 6 floors below street level, and walked the long corridor to my corner. I was balancing a coffee and my bag and thinking about a batch of claim files I needed to finish before 4 a.m., which is why I was already rounding the corner to my desk before I registered that something was different. I stopped. There was a woman sitting in the empty cubicle. New ergonomic chair, the expensive mesh kind the firm ordered for ergonomics complaints. Grey wool cardigan, dark hair pulled back tightly. Sitting with her back completely straight, facing her monitor, typing. The typing was the detail that my brain snagged on first, not the fact of her presence, which I immediately began constructing explanations for, but the sound of it, which was continuous in a way that typing is not. No pause is for spacebar, no hesitation between words, no rhythm of thought interrupting the mechanical rhythm of the keys. Just a ceaseless, perfectly even staccato, like a machine running a fixed process, rather than a person transcribing variable content. I said hello. She didn't respond or turn around. I stood there for a moment with my coffee going cold in my hand, and then I went to my own cubicle and sat down and started my shift, because the alternative was making an issue of a co-worker being focused to acknowledge greeting, which is not the kind of thing you escalate to management on your first interaction with a new hire you know nothing about. Over the following hours, I watched her through the gap in the partition, the way you watch something that your conscious mind is still arguing with your instincts about. She did not shift her weight. She did not reach for anything on the desk. She did not rub her eyes or roll her neck or do any of the small involuntary things person does during 4 hours of continuous sedentary work. The minor physical negotiations with gravity and discomfort that are so constant and so automatic, we don't notice them until they're absent. Her arms moved. Her fingers struck the keys. Everything else was still with the stillness of something that does not have body's needs, only a body's appearance. Around 3 a.m., the ozone smell that was always present in the basement changed. Something underneath it sharpened into a metallic quality, the specific smell of blood on cold metal, clean and mineral and wrong in the context of a carpeted office floor. It was coming from her side of the partition. I sat with this and I told myself the things you tell yourself. She was eccentric, she had a condition, she was new and anxious and performing diligence. The smell was from the server racks, doing something I didn't understand. I told myself these things and I kept working, and I opened the network drive to upload my completed batch. There was a new user profile actively writing files to the server. The username was a 12-digit number, no name. I clicked on the most recently uploaded document because I was looking for any distraction from the sound of that unbroken typing, and from the smell, and from the thing my instincts were insisting I acknowledge. The file opened. It was not medical data or insurance claims or any of the document types we processed on that floor. It was a single sequence of its 8 numbers with a specific internal formatting repeated across every line of the document for as many pages as I scrolled through. Identical top to bottom, no variation. I closed the file and opened another one she had just uploaded. Different sequence, same format, same repetition. I took the first sequence and put it in. The company employee ID search filled and waited while the system processed it. The ID belonged to a security guard who worked the main lobby desk upstairs. A man I had seen every night when I came in and signed the log. I took the second sequence and searched that. It belonged to someone in HR, a daytime employee I recognized from the all-hands meeting they had made the night shift attend 6 months ago. I sat very still and thought about what it meant that the figure typing without pause in the empty cubicle next to mine was generating sequence. Is that resolved in the company directory to the full names and positions of specific people who worked in this building? Not randomly. Specifically, one person at a time repeated until the file was full, then the next person the same way. Building something, compiling something, working through a list with the patience and consistency of a process that does not get tired and does not lose its place. By 5 a.m., the copper smell was strong enough that I could taste it, a film at the back of my throat that didn't clear when I swallowed. The sound of the typing had been going for 5 hours without interruption, and it was doing something to my concentration that I can only describe as erosive, the way a sound you cannot tune out eventually stops being background and starts being the only thing in the room. I needed to see her screen. I needed to understand the scale of what was being uploaded to the server. How many files, how many names. I needed something concrete to bring to the security desk upstairs, or I was going to spend the remaining 2 hours of my shift slowly losing my ability to function. I pushed my chair back carefully and stood up and moved out of my cubicle toward hers. The lighting above her desk was wrong, not flickering, not burned out, just dimmer than the adjacent sections in a way that made the corners of the space difficult to resolve clearly. I came around the partition edge and looked at the monitor. It was black. Not in sleep mode, not displaying a screensaver physically unplugged from the wall, the power cord lying on the carpet beside the desk, the plug nowhere near the outlet. I looked at her hands. They were resting flat and motionless on the desk surface. There was no keyboard in front of them. The clacking sound, which had not stopped, which was still going, which I was still hearing, was coming from inside her. From somewhere beneath the grey wool of the cardigan, deep in the chest cavity, a mechanical clicking rhythm that perfectly reproduced the acoustic signature of fingers on keys, steady and unbroken, the way a clock ticks from inside a wall. I could not move. I want to be honest about that. There is a level of fear that does not produce action, that is instead a complete temporary suspension of voluntary movement, and I stood at the edge of that cubicle in that state for what I esteem It was between 10 and 30 seconds, during which the clicking continued and the copper smell intensified, and the shadows in the corners of the space sat with a density that did not correspond to the available light. Then the clicking stopped. The silence was immediate and absolute in the specific way that silence is absolute when it replaces is a sound that has been constant for 5 hours. In that silence, the figure began to turn its head. The motion was slow and accompanied by a sound, a dry, grinding resistance, the sound of material moving against material without sufficient lubrication, the sound that should not come from a neck. It turned until it was facing me over its shoulder, and where there should have been a face there was a pale, smooth, featureless surface, the skin pulled taut over a structure that suggested the right general geometry without easing any of the specific features that make a face legible as human. No eyes, no mouth, no variation in the surface. Just the suggestion of a skull under pale material, turned toward me with the orientation of attention without the apparatus of it. It raised one hand from the desk. The fingers were wrong in number and in articulation, too many joints bending in a sequence that did not correspond to how a hand opens. It was holding a small piece of paper extended toward me. I went backward and down, caught my feet on the carpet edge, hit the floor on my hands and knees, and stayed low and moved fast, and I do not remember making the decision to run so much as I remember being in the stair. Well, the fire door swinging shut behind me, going up 6 flights without stopping and coming out into the lobby where the overnight security guard looked up from his desk, and I kept moving because I could not explain what I needed to explain in that moment to anyone who had not just been in that basement. I handed in my access badge the next morning and quit without notice. I told the daytime supervisor to check the basement security footage for the cubicle next to mine, and I described what I had seen, and he looked at me the way people look at someone whose account they have already decided to categorize before they hear it. He pulled the logs. No one had badgered into the sub-basement that night except me and the other 3 regulars. The camera covering my section of the floor showed the cubicle beside mine as empty for the entire shift. Whatever had been in that chair had come in through something other than the security turnstile, and had not registered on the camera that should have captured it, which is either evidence that I experienced something that left no physical record, or evidence that whatever it was knew how the building's systems worked and had made the relevant arrangements in advance. A week after I quit, I found a news item about Marcus Vance, the security guard whose employee ID had been the first sequence in the first file, dying unexpectedly of a cardiac event in his sleep. 2 days after that, Sarah Jenkins from HR was reported missing. I did not go back to find out if the sequence that came after hers in the upload queue corresponded to my own employee ID number. I have not looked up what my ID number was. I have thought about this decision many times, and I remain comfortable with it, because some information change is nothing about what you can do and everything about what you have to know, and I have enough of that kind already. What I think about most is the paper it was holding out toward me. I don't know what was on it. I have constructed many versions of what might have been on it: a name, a number, a sequence of digits that would have resolved in the company directory to someone I recognized, and I have not been able to settle on which possibility is worse, so I have stopped trying to decide. What I know is that it had been sitting in that chair for 5 hours generating those files, and it had not acknowledged me once during any of that time. And the moment I came around the partition to look at the screen, it turned and it had something ready to give me. It had been waiting for me to come look. It had known I would come look eventually, the way you know that a person working alone in a room with an unexplained sound for long enough will eventually get up to find the source of it, because that is what people do. because curiosity and the need to understand and confirm what our sense is our reporting is not a weakness so much as it is the specific feature of human cognition that certain things have learned to rely on. It had prepared for my approach. It had a piece of paper with something written on it that it wanted me to take. The only decision I made correctly that entire night was the decision not to find out what was on it, and I made it not because I reasoned my way to it, but because my body made it for me before my mind caught up, which is the only reason I am here to describe any of this at all. The echo in the high racks. I've worked over night warehouse shifts for 3 years. You'll learn to ignore the echoes. What you can't ignore is when the echo comes half a second before your foot hits the ground. 1,000,000 square foot distribution warehouse at 3 a.m. is one of the strangest environments a person can occupy. The scale of it defeats normal spatial intuition. The far end of the main aisle is so distant it disappears into a haze of dust and wick lighting the ceiling so high that the ventilation fans near the rafters sound like weather rather than machinery. The 50-foot metal racking systems creating canyon corridors that amplify and distort every sound you make in ways that take months to stop being disorienting. I had been doing overnight inventory there for 8 months, which was long enough to have made a kind of functional peace with all of it. The isolation, the dark, the way your own footsteps followed you around corners half a second after you'd turned them. You'll learn to read the acoustics of a space that large the way you learn anything repeated and necessary. You calibrate. You stop flinching at shadows. You develop a working understanding of what the building sounds like when it's just you, and the ventilation and the settling of metal under temperature change, and you use that understanding to filter signal from noise. That calibration was the thing that made what happened in aisle 22 impossible to dismiss, because it wasn't a flinch at a shadow. It was a violation of physics I had spent 8 months learning to predict. There were 6 of us on the overnight crew. My assigned section that week was aisles 10 through 30 hard, where industrial components, pallets of dense uniform product that scanned quickly and required more physical positioning than actual thought. My co-worker David had aisles 40 through 60, the other side of the building, far enough away that we were effectively alone in our respective sections and communicated entirely by two-way radio. David was quiet and methodical and good at the job, the kind of person who makes an overnight shift feel stable simply by being reliably present on the other end of the radio. That reliability is relevant to what happened later. At 3:30 in the morning, he came over the radio asking if I was in aisle 45. I was 30 feet in the air in aisle 18, scanning hard, where pallets, and I told him no and asked why. There was a pause longer than the question warranted, and then he said he'd seen someone walk past the end of an aisle on the ground floor and thought it was me. I told him no one else was on our side of the building. Security was at the front guard shack. The other 4 crew members were in sections on the opposite end of the floor, and neither of us had any reason to be in each other's territory. He said, "Right, yeah, must have been a shadow," and signed off. I filed it and kept scanning. Large buildings generate peripheral motion. Your visual cortex tries to populate the dark with shapes that match its library of known objects. I had chased enough of my own shadows in that warehouse to know it was a reliable enough explanation for most things. 30 minutes later, I lowered my machine and walked into aisle 22 to check a ground-level bin that hadn't scanned correctly from height. The aisle was dark beyond the reach of my machine's safety light motion sensors at ground level in that section worked inconsistently, and the ambient illumination from the main walkway faded quickly once you were more than 30 feet into the corridor. I was walking toward the bin with my scanner raised when I heard the scuff of my own bit on the concrete, and then half a second later heard it again from somewhere in the dark ahead of me. Not behind me, which is where an echo should come from. Ahead. I stopped walking. The sound stopped. I took another step, deliberately listening, and I heard my bit impact the concrete, and then I heard a bit impact the concrete from the darkness in front of me before my own foot had finished its motion. Not an echo is a reflection, it follows the source. What I was hearing was anticipating the source. Something ahead of me in that aisle was producing my footstep sounds a bit early, as though it had learned the rhythm of my walking and was producing it slightly out of phase. I stood very still. My heart rate had done something significant, and I was aware of my own breathing in the way you become aware of it when something has shifted the situation from routine to not. I called out. My voice went down the aisle and came back from the metal racks in the normal distributed way that I had catalogued across 8 months of shifts. Nothing else came back. I walked to the bin, scanned it, and returned to my machine without running, which took more effort than I would like to admit. And then I picked up the radio because I needed to hear a human voice that was unambiguously coming from a human being I trusted. I keyed the mic and said David's name, and said I was taking my break early, and asked him to meet me at the central cross aisle. The radio clicked. What came back was my own voice, my own words, my own transmission reproduced with a precision that included the specific quality of suppressed unease I had been managing for the past 10 minutes, down to a slight unevenness in my breath between sentences. No background hum of the warehouse in the transmission, which my own radio pickup would have included. Dead clean, flat, the sound of something recorded in a controlled environment and played back through a channel it shouldn't have had access to. I said David's name again, asking if he was messing with the channel. The radio clicked and played that back too, immediately before I had finished speaking. I put the radio down and drove my machine out of that aisle at maximum reverse speed with the safety alarm going, and did not stop until I was in the main arterial walkway with open sightlines in both directions. I drove to this block because David was real and present, and on the other end of a radio that something else had apparently also learned to use, and I needed to confirm his location with my own eyes. His machine was at the end of aisle 45, platform extended, raised to near the ceiling 40 feet up. The top of it lost in the shadows where the motion sensors at height never worked reliably. I stood at the base and called his name up into the dark. No response from the platform. I called again, louder, the sound of my voice bouncing down the aisle and dissipating. Silence from above. Then the sliding sound started. Not from the platform, from the racking above the platform, from the still grating of the upper shelves, a heavy wet dragging sound moving laterally across the structure, the sound of significant weight being repositioned on metal, and David's voice came down through the dark, not over the radio, just his voice out loud, conversational with the specific cadence he used when he was explaining something he considered obvious to someone who didn't understand it yet. He said something had to be found in the dark, that it only worked with the lights off. I asked who he was talking to. The sliding sound moved again, directly overhead. A voice came from directly behind my left ear, not from the rafters, not from the machine, from inches away, and said he was talking to it. I spun around. The aisle behind me was empty inside the range of the safety light, the darkness starting clean at the light's edge. I looked back up at the platform. The metal mesh of the raised floor, I could see David lying flat on his stomach, face pressed against the grate, looking straight down at me. His eyes were catching the light from below in the way eyes catch light when they are open very wide and not blinking, reflecting it back with the flatness of someone who is present in body and not in the way that matters. From the shelf above his platform above, where the racking extended another 10 feet above the machine's maximum height, an arm came down. Long, pale in the bad light, the fingers articulated with too many points of flex. It moved to the back of David's head and rested there, and David did not react, did not flinch, did not break his stare down at me. A voice from the dark above him, layered in the specific way that multiple voices become a single voice when they speak in perfect unison, said to come up. Said they were doing inventory. I ran. I have spent time since then sitting with the shame of that I left him there, that I didn't try to operate his machine and bring the platform down, that I didn't do anything except turn and run on foot down the main aisle toward the front of the building. I have also spent time understanding that the shame is survivable and the alternative might not have been, and that there are moments where the body makes the right decision without consulting the part of the mind that will have to live with it afterward. I ran the full length of that building, which is a distance that takes longer to cover than you expect when you are running in steel-toed boots on concrete and the darkness stretch is ahead of you for what feels like the full extent of possible space. For the entire length of that run, I heard footsteps behind me, one pace back, perfectly matching my stride, and then not matching it, then matching it again, the way something matches a rhythm when it is learning it rather than when it already knows it. I went through the emergency exit and the alarms went off, and I kept going until I was on the grass outside. The police searched for 6 hours and found nothing. David's machine was lowered to the ground when they reached it, which it had not been when I left. The platform was empty. The security cameras covering this block had lost power at exactly 3:30 in the morning, which is when David had first radioed me about the figure he'd seen walking at ground level, which means the cameras went out at the beginning rather than the end of it, which means whatever was in that building had dealt with the cameras before it dealt with anything else. David has not been found. The official record describes him as a missing person. I know what that record is missing, and I also know there is no version of telling it to the people who maintain that record that produces anything other than the outcome where I become the problem to be explained rather than the explanation. I don't work over night shifts anymore. I don't work in large buildings with high ceilings and poor lighting and long aisles that swallow sound in complicated ways. What I do sometimes on the street, in a parking garage, in any space where my footsteps should produce a straight forward echo, is stop mid-stride and listen to see if the sound behind me stops at the same time mine does, or if it takes an extra beat, or if it stops a fraction early, as though whatever is producing it realized I had stopped and corrected. Most of the time, it stops when it should. Most of the time, the acoustics are exactly what they should be, and there is nothing in them that doesn't belong. I have learned to accept most of the time as sufficient. I have learned to keep walking when the math is close enough. What I have not been able to do, and what I have stopped expecting I will ever be able to do, is stop listening entirely. The calibration that I spent 8 months building in that warehouse did not go away when I left. It just changed what it is calibrated for.